Today on the Perception and Action podcast, what are intrinsic dynamics? How do they shape how we learn new skills? How do they result in different routes to learning and seemingly lead to some athletes being able to self-organize better than others? How should we take this into account when coaching? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to address a question that I get asked a lot when discussing coaching methods like the CLA and differential learning. Why do certain athletes seem to be better able to self-organize and respond more effectively to constraints manipulations than others? While there are many factors that influence the answer to this question, today I want to focus on one that I think is particularly important: the intrinsic dynamics of coordination. What do we mean by intrinsic dynamics here? Well, let's break the term down. By dynamics, we mean the patterns of coordination, or referring back to my last episode, the positions of the attractors in state space. By intrinsic, we mean naturally belonging to, or that are pre-existing before any training begins. To understand this in more detail, let's first look at how this has been studied using the simple lab task of inter-limb coordination. We will get to more complex sports skills later. So, imagine you're a music instructor and you have a student that wants to learn to play the drums. Before you give any type of instruction, you want to see what the learner can already do. To assess the intrinsic dynamics of a performer, we use a method developed by Zanone and Kelso called a scan or a scanning probe, in which we assess to what degree the learner can produce different patterns of coordination under a given set of constraints. For this, we're going to manipulate an essential variable. This is a variable that summarizes the relationship between different degrees of freedom in coordination. For inter-limb coordination in drumming, the essential variable is the relative phase of the two drumsticks. In the lab studies, a metronome with small LED lights on it is used to create a visual stimulus to indicate the relative phase that the participant should try to drum at. For this, other variables are held constant. For example, in this case, the drumming frequency is held constant, usually at 1 Hz or each stick hitting the drum once per second. For the scan, we ask the participant to try and produce relative phases from 0 degrees, that is perfectly in phase with both sticks hitting the drum at the same time, all the way to 180 degrees, which is perfect antiphase, where when one stick hits the drum, the other is at its maximum height away from the drum. At each relative phase, we measure how accurately they can produce the desired pattern. What should we expect to find when we do this? Imagine we're talking about a person that has never picked up drumsticks in their life. In a traditional view of motor learning, I think we should expect that all novice participants would produce very high errors that are roughly the same for all relative phases. Why would a person show any patterns of coordination for a task they've never done before? But that is not what is found at all. When a scanning probe like the one I described is performed, the errors in performance will be about 5 times lower at 0 and 180 degrees of phase for most participants. Referring back to my last episode, before receiving any instruction in drumming, most people are bistable, with attractors at 0 and 180 degrees relative phase. For these two particular values of the essential variable, behaviors are more stable. For other relative phases, errors are much higher because coordination is pulled towards these attractors. So for example, if I asked you to drum at 45 degrees relative phase, your errors wouldn't just be random. Your inability to perform at this value would largely be due to the fact that when trying to drum at 45 degrees, you would start moving towards a 0-degree pattern. This bistable pattern of coordination with attractors at 0 and 180 are the new learner's intrinsic dynamics. Every new learner has coordination tendencies, which express the preference to adopt certain specific patterns of coordination rather than others, because these patterns are more stable, efficient, and comfortable for the system. Before looking at why they occur and how they affect learning, let's first look at another surprising effect we see in these studies. That is, when you do a scanning probe for inter-limb coordination, you find that not all individuals have the same intrinsic dynamics. Roughly 75% of adults exhibit the bistable intrinsic dynamics I just described, while the other 25% show a completely different pattern, tri-stability. When you do a scan from 0 to 180 degrees, for some participants there will be a local minimum in errors at 0 and 180, but also at 90 degrees. So for some people, there are 3 attractors in the state space defined by relative phase. For a 90-degree relative phase, when one drumstick is contacting the drum, the other is at half its maximum height. This is again something we would never expect in the traditional view of motor learning. Why would there be individual differences for a task that people have never performed before? There are many other examples of intrinsic dynamics like this. They even occur in infants. For example, in a study published in 1993 by Esther Thelen and colleagues, distinct patterns of intrinsic dynamics in infants learning to reach for objects were found. While some had initial movements that were large and forceful and needed to be damped down, other infants had movement tendencies that were smaller and more subtle. So the bottom line is, we all have these pre-existing coordination tendencies that we bring to the table when learning a new skill. Where do they come from? Well, it's important to emphasize we're not just talking about genetically predetermined pre-programmed patterns. To quote from the Thelen article, we use the term intrinsic dynamics here to denote the collective behavior of the system in the absence of any specific task requirements or task matching. The intrinsic dynamics are not just within the infant, but take into account the non-specific effects of the environment, such as gravity. We do not mean innate or genetic by the term intrinsic." End quote. It's also important to note that intrinsic dynamics are not the same thing as the individual or organismic constraints in Carl Newell's model. Our individual constraints, such as our height, our arm length, our goals, etc., influence but do not completely determine our intrinsic dynamics, because the latter also depends on how we interact with our environment. So, for example, it's entirely possible that 2 people with very similar individual constraints could have very different intrinsic dynamics. For example, one might be bistable and the other tristable. So intrinsic dynamics arise from a complex interaction between constraints that will be very difficult to predict a priori without actually measuring them. Many intrinsic dynamics also seem to be inherent properties of our motor system that apply to many different tasks. For example, the tendency to have stable attractors for in-phase and anti-phase movements can be seen for a wide range of behaviors, including walking, doing a puzzle, eating, and in sports like cross-country skiing and gymnastics. Why is understanding intrinsic dynamics so important? Because it is the foundation on which the learning of any skill is going to be built. To quote Zanone and Kelso, the intrinsic dynamics of the system serve as a frame of reference for the evaluation of the qualitative transformations in the coordination during learning. Learning a new skill is viewed as the transition from one stable state towards another. The behavioral dynamics elaborated during learning result from the integration into the intrinsic dynamics of the system of one or several states of coordination that initially did not figure there. The heart of the process of this change is the competition between what the performer wants or is instructed to do and the natural tendencies of the system to prefer certain modes of coordination. Viewed from this perspective, the product of learning can be considered as a modification of the intrinsic dynamics. End quote. To see how intrinsic dynamics influence motor learning, we can again look at lab studies on using the drumming inter-limb coordination task. After the scanning probe is completed, participants in these studies are trained to produce a new relative phase. Importantly, the to-be-learned phase differs depending on the intrinsic dynamics of the participant. For bistable participants with attractors at 0 and 180, the new pattern is set at 90 degrees. While for those with tri-stability and attractors at 0, 90, and 180, the new pattern is set at 135 degrees. 135 is chosen because it's halfway between 2 existing attractors for this group. So for both groups, there's going to be a competition between the new attractor they're trying to establish and the existing ones present before training. During training, the to-be-learned relative phase is again specified visually with LED lights like in the scanning probe. However, during training, participants are provided feedback about the accuracy and variability of their movements after each trial that was not present during the scanning probe. Before getting to the results, I want to emphasize something here. From this example, we can clearly see a very straightforward example of why intrinsic dynamics matter and why some individuals appear to self-organize better than others. Imagine that we never did this initial scanning probe and just tried to train all participants to quote-unquote learn a new relative phase of 90 degrees. For 3/4 of our participants, this would be challenging and would require a lot of practice, while for the other quarter, it would be trivial because the to-be-learned task is already part of their intrinsic dynamics. We might call the latter group great learners or fast self-organizers, even though in reality there's no learning or self-organization going on at all. But what was actually found in these studies? To understand the results, we need to look at both the accuracy and the variability of the movements. Accuracy is assessed using a measure called absolute error, which measures how far away from the target you are without taking the sign of the error into account. Variability is assessed using a typical measure of standard deviation. To understand the difference between these two measures, think about throwing darts. If I consistently miss the bullseye by 6 inches to the right, I'm going to have a very large constant error of 6 inches, but low variability. If I miss the bullseye 6 inches to the right, then 6 inches to the left, then 6 to the right, and 6 to the left, so on, I'm going to have the same constant error, 6 inches, because the direction of the error is not taken into account, but now I'm also going to have relatively high variability. Let's look at how these two measures changed for the two groups in the coordination study. First, let's look at the bistable group, trying to learn a 90 degrees relative phase pattern. For this group, in the first 10 trials or so, there's a very large error of around 45 degrees. So when trying to produce 90, they produce 45 or 135 instead. This is exactly what we would expect based on their intrinsic dynamics. They're being pulled away from the goal phase towards their established attractors, resulting in a pattern that is roughly halfway in between. But then they eventually figure it out, and the constant error falls to a roughly about 10 degrees or lower and stays there for the rest of training. Things get even more interesting when you look at variability. During those first 10 trials when they're fighting against the old attractors, variability is fairly moderate, at about 10 degrees standard deviation. It then rises dramatically, nearly doubling for the next 10 trials or so, then falls to a very low value of about 5 degrees and stays there. So putting these effects together, when learning 90 degrees, the performer is initially very inaccurate and moderately variable. They then become very accurate but highly variable, like missing the bullseye by 6 inches but in different directions each time, up, down, left, right, etc. Finally, they become both highly accurate and have low variability in producing the task goal of a relative phase of 90 degrees. From this pattern of results, it has been proposed that these individuals are learning through bifurcation. That is, they're completely restructuring their attractor landscape to create a new third attractor at 90 degrees relative phase. The sudden increase in variability reflects exploration to find a new coordination solution to achieve the task. Then the drop in variability reflects stabilization of this new attractor. So learning this new task has completely reorganized the attractor landscape, changing their intrinsic bistability into tri-stability. What about the other group of participants that were initially tri-stable and asked to learn a new relative phase of 135 degrees? The pattern of results for this group is quite different. For accuracy, instead of there being a steep drop in constant error, it starts relatively high and just gradually decreases to roughly end up at the same value of around 10 degrees as the other group. In terms of variability, there's really no change at all across practice trials for this group as they stay relatively moderate level of variability, importantly higher than the first group. From this pattern of results, it has been proposed that individuals with tri-stable intrinsic dynamics learn in a very different way. Instead of altering the attractor landscape and establishing a new attractor at the target phase, they learn to perform the new task by shifting their existing attractor that was at 90 degrees to the target phase of 135 degrees. So in the end, the attractor landscape looks the same with 3 valleys, but the positions of them are just altered slightly. This is referred to as the shift route to learning. So we can see here that even though the end results in terms of performance were similar, high accuracy and relatively low variability, the way the different groups got there was very different and would look very different to an instructor or coach observing. For one group, there was clear exploration and changes in stability, while for the other, there's just a gradual shift instead. To quote Kelso, "On the one hand, the bifurcation route generates qualitative change in an initially bistable behavioral repertoire by adding new stable patterns. Bifurcation is thus a dynamical mechanism for novelty. The sudden creation of a new attractive state in the landscape of the coordination dynamics is a reflection of the principle of selection via instability. On the other hand, the shift mechanism generates smooth adaptive change. The initial behavior repertoire is already here tri-stable, and learning takes the form of a gradual change. The learner's dynamic landscape is altered not in terms of the number of attractive states, but only in terms of its layout. As a result, behavior shifts gradually in the direction of the to-be-learned pattern without any instability or gain in stability. How humans learn is contingent. Depending on the individual's initial repertoire, adaptive changes are governed by a shift mechanism or a bifurcation mechanism." End quote. Before leaving these intra-limb coordination studies and going into more sports-related tasks, I just wanted to mention a couple more interesting findings. As discussed in a really nice review paper by Kostrubeck and colleagues, there also seem to be attentional and memory differences in the bifurcation and shift routes to learning. First, it has been shown that the bifurcation group that learned that 90-degree pattern is better able to reproduce it in a retention test a month later, as compared to the shift group that learned the new pattern of 135 degrees. This is perhaps not surprising, given that in the initially bistable group there was a qualitative change to the coordination dynamics, followed by a period of stabilization. The group that was initially tri-stable seems to show a pattern similar to the idea of metastability I talked about in my last episode. That is, instead of learning a new pattern and then making it highly stable, they stay in a state of relative instability, which we saw in their relatively higher variability. This allows them to quickly shift to a new coordination solution as needed. So again, here we see the trade-off between flexibility and stability in our motor system. The other interesting effect that has been found is in terms of the attentional demands involved in learning. This can be assessed by using a dual task in the form of an auditory probe. So for example, while the person is learning the new relative phase, the primary task, you could present sounds over a speaker and measure the reaction time in responding to them, the secondary task. A longer reaction time for the secondary task indicates that their attention is more absorbed by the primary task. Using this method, it has been found that for initially bistable participants, the attentional demands of learning the new task are relatively high, shown by slow probe reaction times, and they decrease significantly as the task is learned. For the initially tri-stable participants, the attentional demands remain constant, no change in reaction time for the entire training session. To quote the authors, "On the whole, qualitative, attention-demanding alterations in the behavioral repertoire following the creation of a novel pattern is a persistent effect, whereas the mere shift of an extant pattern towards the required value entails a far shorter-lived, less attention-demanding adjustment. Although a similar degree of accuracy and stability may be reached as a result of learning, the bifurcation mechanism invariably leads to a larger gain in stability, longer-lasting recall, and a higher attentional cost than the shift route." End quote. One last point with regards to the question I raised earlier. Where do our intrinsic dynamics come from? Kelso has hypothesized that the two patterns observed in these studies likely build on each other and are successive phases of learning. That is, participants that are tri-stable must have been bistable at an earlier point in time. Bistability and bifurcation are the primary cornerstones of learning. They set the range of what is possible. Tri-stability and shifts can be seen more as an adjustment that is built on top of this foundation. But in sum, these results show that there's no single pathway for the behavioral change with learning, even for a relatively simple lab task like this. Instead, we learn by different routes and at different rates depending on, among other things, our intrinsic dynamics. Turning to more sporting-related tasks, I next want to look at a study of volleyball serving published by Temperato and colleagues in 1997. As I mentioned, in-phase and anti-phase coordination patterns seem to be part of the intrinsic dynamics for a wide range of tasks we perform. So the author sought to examine to what extent they exist in volleyball. 16 participants, 6 experts from the French national team and 10 undergrads who had never played volleyball, were asked to make overhand serves with their movements recorded with high-speed video. Cross correlations were calculated between 3 joint pairs, the shoulder-elbow, elbow-wrist, and shoulder-wrist, with the sign of the correlation used to identify in-phase and anti-phase patterns. What was found? The novices showed a strong tendency towards in-phase dynamics. For roughly 75% of their serves, all three joint pairs were coupled in phase. The pattern of results was very different for the experts. For less than 10% of their serves were all three joint pairs coupled in phase. Instead, these participants predominantly used a pattern in which both the elbow-wrist and shoulder-elbow joint pairs were in phase, but the shoulder-wrist joint pair was coupled out of phase. The degree of coupling, as assessed by the magnitude of the cross-correlation, was also significantly lower for experts. Referring back to episode 185, this is the pattern predicted by Bernstein's theory of motor learning. Less rigid coupling and more freeing of degrees of freedom at higher levels of skill. But again, we can see here that there are distinct intrinsic patterns of coordination adopted that are subsequently altered with training. The last study I wanted to look at today is an interesting one by Pacheco and Newell published in 2018, which examined coordination dynamics in throwing. Instead of focusing on how our intrinsic dynamics influence the learning of the task, their goal was to look at how the dynamics that emerged after training influenced transfer of training to another task. As I've discussed several times on the podcast now, it has been argued that the degree of transfer between two tasks depends primarily on their similarity. Going between skills with very dissimilar task dynamics, for example, pitching and hitting, will lead to low transfer, while going between more similar ones, hitting left-handed versus hitting right-handed, will lead to better transfer. In other words, if we know the details of the task being performed, then we should be able to predict if and how transfer will occur. As the authors point out, there are some major problems with this view due to the individual differences in motor learning. Imagine I'm going to train you in task A with the hope it transfers to improved performance in task B. The first issue with trying to predict transfer solely based on the similarity between task A and task B is the one I'm focusing on today, intrinsic dynamics. Because individuals have different coordination tendencies at the start of training with task A, they're likely going to have different routes to learning and have different attractor landscapes at the end of training with task A. Therefore, they are likely to respond very differently to task B. Again, think about my example of training a 90 degrees phase pattern for bistable versus tristable performers. Second is an issue I talked about in episode 158. If learning task A is going to require a search for a new coordination solution, we know that individuals search space differently. Therefore, it's likely they will use different information sources to perform task A. The final issue is movement redundancy. Unless task A is designed to be an overly restrictive single degree of freedom task, the redundancy in our motor system will allow for multiple different ways to achieve the task goal. So in other words, in training with task A, the coordination pattern that is learned will be both specific, in that it can be used to achieve the specific goal of task A, and individual, different for each performer. So what influences how and if transfer occurs then? In Pacheco and Newell's view, this depends on the third aspect of the coordination solution that is learned, generalizability. Even though we learn movement solutions that are highly specific to the task at hand, it does not necessarily mean that these solutions cannot be used for other tasks. Coordination functions can be parameterized for other contexts by making small adjustments to the relationship between information and action. This brings a very different view of transfer. To quote the authors, "In this way, transfer is not a matter of the similarity of the task space of the original practice with the task space of the transfer test, as is currently held. Rather, transfer is about the similarity of the coordination function acquired through practice and the requirements of the transfer test. If the coordination function can be parameterized to accommodate the transfer test, then we would observe positive transfer of training." End quote. To test this idea, 17 college students were asked to perform a task which involved throwing a golf ball into differently shaped targets on a table. So, as the authors state in the paper, they were essentially asking people to play beer pong, which they admit helped for recruiting college students. The task used in the training was throwing towards a triangular target area. Training involved 210 throws per day for 5 days. Participants were told they could use any throwing technique they wished. There were 2 transfer tests which used a very thin hexagonal shape. This target was chosen because it can be used to create different tolerances for error along different axes. In the horizontal transfer test, the hexagon was oriented so that its short axis was in the direction of the throw. Thus, there was a large tolerance for lateral errors and a small tolerance for errors in the length of the throw. In the vertical transfer test, the long axis was in the direction of the throw, thus creating the opposite pattern of tolerances. Participants completed 20 trials of each transfer test. Movements were recorded using a Vicon system, and coordination was characterized using a principal components analysis. What was found? First, as predicted, even though all participants practiced the exact same task of throwing to the triangular target, and they all showed performance improvements, they did not converge on the same coordination solution. Some used mostly elbow and wrist flexion, like in throwing a dart, while others used mostly the shoulder in an underhand throw. Some released the ball in the same position each throw and varied velocity, while others varied both position and velocity. What about the transfer tests? Overall, performance was poorer on the horizontal transfer test, in which there was less tolerance for errors in the length of the throw. I'm not going to go into all the details of the principal components analysis. Please see the paper if you're interested. But the results also strongly supported the author's main hypothesis, in that there was considerable individual differences in the performance in this horizontal transfer test. And these depended on the nature of the coordination function developed during training with the triangular target. In a nutshell, the coordination solution used by some participants allowed for easier correction of errors in the length of the throw, leading to better transfer. The authors summed this all up nicely. Quote, although specificity, individuality, and generalizability as properties of transfer can be thought of as contradictory to each other, they do not need to be so. Being specific to a task refers to being able to act and achieve the goal in a given task. This does not mean that the solution is functional only to the current task, rather that it does work in the present task. Individuality of the solution refers to the fact that there are numerous solutions afforded by a redundant task, and individuals differ with respect to the ones they acquire through practice. Finally, generalizability reflects the fact that the system acquires coordination functions that are both specific or functional to a given situation, but these can be parameterized to other contexts depending on its characteristics. End quote. And again, relevant to the topic of the day, the coordination dynamics an athlete brings to the table are going to strongly influence how they respond to training and how well the training transfers to competition. This will be true whether we're talking about the purely intrinsic dynamics of a novice or the dynamics that have developed from some previous training in a more skilled performer. To sum up today's episode, I want to talk about some implications for coaching from all of this. Hopefully, we can all see that understanding an athlete's intrinsic dynamics is critical for knowing the best way to help guide their learning of a new task. Therefore, I think there's a checklist of things a coach can do related to this. Number 1, identify the essential variables of coordination for your sporting task. What does good coordination in your task look like? Can it be described in terms of the relative phase of different limbs, for example, their position, their velocity, their timing, whatever? What we're looking for here is a way to summarize patterns in the movement. Number 2, take the time to do a version of Kelso's scanning probe on your athletes. That is, before coming up with interventions and instructions, spend some practice time observing and measuring their initial coordination tendencies. This should be done over a range of conditions in which you change the essential variable identified in step number 1. Number 3, do a version of the scanning probe again later in training to assess learning. How has practice changed the nature of their coordination? Number 4, expect big differences in stability during self-organization and try to avoid comparing one athlete to another. I think one of the reasons some athletes seem to be quote-unquote poor self-organizers in the eyes of coaches is that they're being compared to other athletes that are using a different route to learning the task. As shown in the studies I talked about today, for some athletes there will be periods of exploration and instability, while for others there won't. So I think we always need to keep in mind that learning is going to look different for different athletes. And step 5, consider the generalizability of the coordination function that is being developed in training. As Pacheco and Newell's study nicely shows, performers can develop a movement solution that works in practice that may or may not be able to be reparameterized to allow for transfer to the dynamic environment of competition. The key here is, again, of course, adding variability to practice conditions and assessing how the coordination function can be adapted. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts and a bi-weekly newsletter, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled. Cut you quit.